Make up mind. Fight.
So recently, I beat Sekiro Shadows Die twice for the first time, and I really liked it. I found its combat to be deep and one of a kind, I found its bosses and mini-bosses to be riveting, and I even enjoyed its uniquely spine-shattering difficulty as far as FromSoft games go. All in all, a comfortable new inclusion to my 50 favorite games of all time list. That said, even if I did thoroughly enjoy my time with the game, there definitely still was some stuff about it that I kind of tilted my head at. Like, hey, why is there a set of mini-bosses that can debuff you, have instant kill status effects, and require a very limited resource to actually damage? Very odd design choices. And this got me thinking, even if you really love and vibe with a game, it's absolutely still okay to acknowledge that it has faults and that you don't need to click 100% with everything that it does to say you enjoy it. Everything created by human hands has some degree of roughness and imperfection. That's how you know it's an authentic work of art. This is a shot at AI, by the way. And this line of thought made me want to reanalyze some of my favorite games of all time. So in this video, I want to take a look at my concrete top 10 favorite games list and see if I can find and identify my biggest problem with each one. Not as a takedown or indictment on these games that I love, but rather to see if I really do have a nuanced perspective on them. I want to stress that, despite everything I'm going to say in this video, these are still my top 10 favorite games of all time. The ones that I love and replay more than any other out of the 300 plus games that I've beaten. I'm doing this out of tough love rather than malice. If I'm familiar enough with these games to be able to identify these faults, then that's how you know that I've played them a ton. Also, just to establish a baseline, here's a quick video rundown of my top 10 favorite games from 10 to 1. You ready? Pokemon Leafgreen, Metal Gear Solid 3, A Hat in Time, Hotline Miami, Bloodborne, Red Dead Redemption 2, Resident Evil 4, Dark Souls 1, No More Heroes, and Paper Mario for the N64. Now that we've established our usual suspects, it's time to place them under surgical precision and find their biggest imperfections. Let's dive in. Let's start off with my 10th favorite game of all time, Pokemon Leafgreen. This is probably a weird choice both for favorite Pokemon game and 10th favorite game of all time for most people, as Fire Red and Leafgreen have kind of a reputation for being pretty lackluster Pokemon experiences these days. They are extremely bare-bones Gen 3 upgrades of the original Kanto games, their graphics and music do not push the GBA's limits by any stretch, and they are incredibly easy. That said, Leafgreen specifically was my nostalgic childhood Pokemon game. I was playing this thing well into the 2010s when Black and White were out, and even today, it's still my favorite Pokemon game to replay for things like Nuzlocke and randomizers. Leafgreen is a comfort game for me, and that's not the last time I'll be saying that about one of these games in this video. That said, even my rose-tinted nostalgia glasses can only mask so many shortcomings, and unfortunately, I find Leafgreen's biggest problem to be just how mindless it can be. Again, this is both a bare-bones Gen 3 conversion of Red and Blue, and laughably easy with some basic planning and Pokemon knowledge, meaning that there will inevitably be long stretches of playtime where you're just navigating routes, stomping trainer after trainer at no risk, and just kind of idly progressing through the game, mashing the A button while listening to a podcast or something. It really cannot go understated just how mind-numbing a vanilla Fire Red and Leafgreen playthrough can be once you're familiar with its game. As far as Pokemon goes, this isn't at all a problem that's exclusive to Fire Red and Leafgreen, as pretty much any Pokemon main story crumbles once you're an adult with experience and game knowledge, but it's extra noteworthy here because there is very little of substance to keep you hooked otherwise. Even other infamously easy and mindless Pokemon games like X and Y or Sun and Moon have beautiful visuals for the 3DS or actual stories to keep you invested, whereas Fire Red and Leaf Green are the most baseline Pokemon-ass Pokemon games you could possibly play. They're like the platonic ideal of a Pokemon game. All in all, while I definitely do still love Pokemon Leaf Green and do often replay it under different stipulations, I'll be the first to admit that I'm usually doing it through less honest means with the speed up feature enabled these days. This is my childhood Pokemon game and my favorite to replay, but with experience comes boredom. I still love it though. going from a game that's arguably placed too high in my favorites to a game that's arguably placed much too low, we have Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater. This is the second most recent induction into my gaming hall of fame. Not in terms of release year, it is 2 decades old, but rather in terms of my first time playing it. I beat MGS3 to completion for the first time in early 2024 on the Master Collection, and to say that this thing immediately engrossed me would be a massive understatement. There's an argument to be made for this being one of the objective best games in my top 10. It's got an amazing, high-stakes, personal, and gripping story, incredibly layered and deep gameplay mechanics to always keep you guessing, and some of the best production values in the industry for the time of its release. The only reason it's not higher on my list is because I only beat it for the first time around a year and a half ago, and it hasn't really had time to fully mythologize itself for me yet. That said, my tour with this game on the Master Collection was not my first time attempting to play through it. I had previously tried it on the Xbox 360 through the Metal Gear Solid HD Collection, and I was so bad at it, primarily due to me not being able to acclimate to its controls. This is where my only real tangible issue with this game comes in. If you're used to more conventional third or first-person shooters, MGS3's unique control scheme will definitely take some adjustment. This is less of an objective negative and more of a personal hang-up I should stress, but when I first attempted to play through this game, I just could not vibe with its control scheme. It's a stealth game, right? You're meant to sneak around and carefully take out targets through various means while avoiding detection. This is all well and good, but I could not wrap my head around this game not having a crouch movement option when I first attempted to play it. You can either walk or run while standing up, or go prone and crawl. Most versions of MGS3, save for the 3DS version, do not feature a crouch walk, and the lengthy animation Snake would perform when transitioning from standing to crouching to prone based on your inputs got me killed so much. On top of this, the shooting and combat controls are very non-conventional based on what I'm used to from playing other third-person shooters from around the same time, even if I am aware that they are pretty standard for Metal Gear Solid. You have to aim your gun in first person with R1, and then independently press and release the leftmost face button to fire. The other face buttons are mapped to things like melee, confirm, and again, crouch, and the shoulder buttons are mapped to switching your weapons. This is all well and good when you're used to it, but compared to something like Resident Evil 4, another 2005 game with third-person shooter mechanics that I had played prior to this, it definitely took some adjustment. And while I definitely did make that adjustment and thoroughly enjoyed this game, I can somewhat see this kind of stuff being a hang-up for players who are less receptive to meeting a game in its original context. Again though, it's really just a personal thing. I was just bad at the game, and it should not take away from what a masterpiece MGS3 is. Next up is A Hat in Time, a Kickstarter indie game that I very much enjoyed since I first played it at release. Between its adorable characters and surprisingly witty writing, its fun and inventive platforming, and its incredible music, A Hat in Time is an indie success story that proves the merits of crowdfunding when done ethically and then some. It's worth noting though that you can absolutely see this game's relative budget restrictions in certain places, like its very limited amount of environments and characters, but to its credit, it's also very resourceful in how it uses these things, and it's hard to notice until you're really familiar with the game. All in all, a delightful time. While I do respect how clever A Hat in Time is in terms of how it utilizes its assets, I unfortunately do find one of its core 4 levels to be kind of a weak link in this regard, and for me, that level is gonna have to be Alpine Skyline. Now, I have no idea if this is a hot take or anything. I'm not really tapped into the common community consensus on which A Hat in Time levels are the best or the worst, but since my first playthrough, I've never messed with Alpine Skyline. And to its credit, it's got nothing to do with this level's aesthetics. It is a beautiful mountain region outfitted with fittingly Alpine architecture and an overall rustic charm. My problems with this level, and why I view it to be A Hat in Time's overall weakest link, come down more to what it does on a gameplay and story level. For one, Alpine Skyline represents a pretty significant departure from pretty much every previous world in A Hat in Time. Every locale you've explored before this had a small collection of individual self-contained episodes to complete, each having a unique take on the world's setting, story, and physical design. I'd most immediately compare it to Super Mario Sunshine. This formula is used for the first 3 separate levels, and it works like a dream. However, Alpine Skyline decides to shake things up significantly, having only a single free roam episode where the immediate environment acts as a hub world to explore for collectibles found within. This is fine.
In theory, communism works. In theory.
However, it's held back pretty significantly by its execution. For one, it severely compromises the game's otherwise wildly varied setups and structures for its mission. You're pretty much just doing platforming gauntlets from start to finish. For two, the individual collectibles are all found along their own isolated, separate, splintered paths, basically acting as their own episodes and everything but name, kind of invalidating the whole free roam concept to begin with. And for three, Alpine Skyline is the last traditional world in the game, and having a significant structural shakeup this late into the adventure is more likely to annoy players than excite them from my experience. It kind of reminds me of The Messenger, a game I personally didn't really like, and how it spends 3 hours of its runtime being a linear platformer before deciding in what seems like the 11th hour that it wants to be a Metroidvania and continue. If you're going to introduce a shakeup like this, it needs to be done much earlier as to not be jarring or off-putting. Additionally, this level lacks almost entirely in a Hat in Time's usual character and writing wit. Every other world in this game is occupied by at least one or two core NPC characters or factions that all have delightful personalities and funny things to say. And while Alpine Skyline definitely does have NPCs, they're really nothing special by this game's lofty standards. They just kind of stand around and point you in the right direction. Compared to DJ Grooves or Snatcher, not really memorable. This level also notably lacks a boss fight, instead having a more atypical platforming gauntlet as its final challenge. This is kind of lame, as the Hat in Time's bosses are generally incredible by platformer standards. All of this combines to give Alpine Skyline a weird vibe of being severely compromised. Like, it's the main place in the game where you can tell they only had a couple $100,000 budget and a very small team. Its placement as the final traditional level in the game only adds to this, like they had to cobble together a final world with very few remaining resources. Its strange structure, its lack of significant characterization or voice acting, its singular setting, it all just gives a very strange vibe. I definitely won't hold that against them though, especially considering how much I love the rest of the game. But yeah, I'm never super jazzed to reach Alpine Skyline on any repeat playthrough of a Hat in Time. Hotline Miami is a game that's near and dear to my heart, a foundational game for my taste and interest that I played for the first time when I was way too young to. This neon-lit, blood-soaked alternate take on 1980s Florida really helps you understand why we decided to rename that place to Moon Pie Town not too long ago. Jokes aside, Hotline Miami is an absolutely stellar gameplay and aesthetic experience, its speed and level design perfectly disguising its true nature as a high execution puzzle game underneath a thick layer of graphic style and some of the most grisly visuals you can get out of a game using sprites. This is actually one of the only games I've ever legitimately attempted to speedrun. I once got a run under an hour a few years ago and would like to try that again sometime. However, the fact that I could comfortably beat Hotline Miami within a fraction of its estimated completion time, despite being generally bad at it, is indicative of an issue with this game as a whole. For a purely single-player game, Hotline Miami's balance is really wonky. The game is obviously difficult, it's blisteringly fast, you die in one hit, and enemies far outnumber you. However, it is so remarkably easy to tip the scales in the player's favor that it's almost laughable. You see, Hotline Miami features unlockable animal masks that can be earned through clearing levels efficiently or diligently exploring, and all of them feature a unique perk. Some of them are pretty useless and only exist to deliberately make the game harder, some are perfectly fine if situational, and some are the Tony mask. The degree to which the Tony mask completely eclipses nearly every other mask in Hotline Miami, specifically for a casual playthrough, is legitimately preposterous. It can be earned after only the first level, and what it does is make all of the player's ordinary punches instant kills on most enemies, as well as speeding up their execution animations. Typically in this game, punching an enemy only downs them, requiring either scavenging a dedicated weapon from around the level, or performing a lengthy kill animation to fully take that enemy out, both putting you at risk of being outed by another enemy and killed. Tony removes both of these variables, effectively enabling you to just kite every normal goon in the game into a barrage of insta-kill punches. What would otherwise be tricky pseudo-puzzles where you have to carefully navigate the level around you, diligently path your route, and be aware of all of your enemies, just becomes a one-sided slobber knocker where you can effortlessly pummel everything in your path. Plus, Tony doesn't actually prevent you from picking up weapons, meaning that you're still fully capable of using guns and throwing items to bait and kill tougher mooks. this. The Tony mask has kind of a reputation for being Hotline Miami on easy mode and for presenting a significantly skewed version of what's otherwise a very difficult game, and is only beaten out in viability for a speedrun by the Brandon mask, another big cat mask that simply ups the player's movement speed. For an ordinary non-speed playthrough though, there is not a better option for blitzing Hotline Miami than the Tony mask. It's so crazy that in Hotline Miami 2, when they introduce a playable character who's named after this mask and wears a disheveled version of it, they had to nerf him by taking away his ability to pick up weapons. I like using the Tony mask, especially if I just want to crank out a quick playthrough of Hotline Miami, but it cannot be denied that such a glaring balance oversight kind of does invalidate a lot of the game's design. There is no reason to learn the levels or experiment with the other masks when Tony the Tiger is proudly saying they're great about his own fists. Chalk this one up to being an issue that I like. Bloodborne is one of the best games of all time, full stop. Seriously, I feel bad for the people doggedly holding out hope for an eventual PC port or cross-generational remaster of this game, because 30 FPS or not, this is still undeniably the peak of FromSoft's illustrious Soulsborne catalog. It's got an engrossing, gothic and Lovecraft-inspired aesthetic, a layered and rewarding to uncover world, sublime music, and some of the best, if hardest, boss encounters in any game I've ever played. Genuinely, this game ranks as a solid second or third place depending on the day for me on my overall rankings of FromSoft's entire boss quality across their whole catalog. To this end, Bloodborne's combat is fine-tuned to near perfection, with all of its bosses feeling as though they're appropriately designed and balanced for the game's mechanics and what the player is capable of. You know, unlike these two chuckle fucks. It's hard to legitimately criticize anything to do with Bloodborne's overall combat design, so instead we're just gonna get really specific. I cannot stand blood vial farming. If you're not in the know, every FromSoft Souls-like except Bloodborne and Demon's Souls share one thing in common. The player's core healing item, typically an Estus Flask or Healing Gourd, is a limited use consumable that's typically very sparse in charges, yet resets to max on either a death or resting at a checkpoint. This ideally means that you'll be able to liberally use them as you scout a new area or throw yourself at a difficult boss without fear of ever permanently running out. If you use them all and die, you'll have your stock reset after respawning. Bloodborne does not do this, instead making its core healing items in blood vials a finite consumable resource. And to be fair, Demon's Souls does the same thing. Yeah, unlike Bloodborne, it is both the first one of these games and showers you in that good greed. By comparison, blood vials in Bloodborne, while not exactly rare, are just uncommon enough from most enemies for it to be alarmingly easy to expend your entire supply if you die repeatedly. If you wind up struggling on a boss or area, gulping through blood vials like mad while making no progress, and repeatedly respawning, you will eventually run out. This is the most that a FromSoft game concretely punishes you for dying repeatedly, and I say that with full knowledge of Sekiro's Dragon Rot and Dark Souls 2's max health drain. And what's extra messed up is that blood vials purchased from the game's primary hub world vendor get more expensive as the game goes on, making it almost a necessity to spend a significant chunk of time grinding vials from enemy drops or grinding souls to spend on blood vials also from enemy drops at least once per playthrough before moving on. You never want to be in that unenviable position of dying to a boss, noticing that your blood vial count is distinctively not 20, and realizing that you have to grind. This isn't a huge issue and can be circumvented by just setting aside some time or one boss kill worth of souls to stocking up at the beginning of a playthrough, but it is so deeply antithetical to FromSoft's typical design mentalities that I genuinely wonder how this mechanic made it into the final game. All I'm saying is, at least one person's playthrough ended because they died one too many times to a boss and didn't want to grind vials to keep trying. And it could happen to you, too. Nah, being real though, this is comparatively a very minor issue that some Bloodborne players will realistically never come across in their playthroughs. This is still one of the best games of all time, and I really am just nitpicking here in this video. Okay, time to move on. Next up is Red Dead Redemption 2, a weird little guy for the purposes of this list, primarily because it's the most recently that a game has been inducted into my favorites. I actually beat RDR2 after I started working on the script for this video, and had to refinagle my whole ordering to accommodate it. As you can tell from its placement here, I actually really loved Red Dead Redemption 2. I'm not typically too high on Rockstar games. I think their sensibilities and satire are just a bit too shouty and on the nose for my liking, but I genuinely found RDR2 to be a really mature, sobering, and most most importantly earnest story of loyalty, loss, and morality, wrapped up with some of the most beautifully tragic characters and thorough gameplay I've ever experienced. I didn't cry after beating Red Dead Redemption 2, but I did have to stand in the shower and think for a really long time. That said, even with all of Red Dead Redemption 2's glaring positives, anyone who's actually played this game to completion will be very quick to tell you that it is far from perfect. Befitting of a Rockstar game, Red Dead Redemption 2 is home to just enough jank and questionable design to really remind you every now and then that you're playing a video game and not watching a movie. There's obviously some bugs, extremely backwards decisions like making the talk to NPC and point your gun inputs the exact same button on controller, the lengthy horse rides that compose a good chunk of the game's runtime, the overall dedication to realism over convenience, and most importantly for this video, a few really lackluster story points. The one I want to discuss today being the Jerma chapter. So, without specific spoilers, at the end of Chapter 4 in Red Dead Redemption 2, the player's plucky Vanderlyn gang of outlaws have found themselves in the aftermath of a spectacularly botched bank robbery, with several members either being killed, arrested, or MIA. They find themselves hiding out on a boat that's supposedly traveling to Tahiti, and with a small surplus of stolen gold in tow, it seems like things are going to shape up. However, the boat is then hit by a storm, causing it to sink, and for the remaining members of the Vanderlyn gang to wash up on the shore of Jerma, a small sugar plantation island off the coast of Cuba. Jerma will be the primary setting of Red Dead Redemption 2's 5th chapter, and is easily the low point of the game for me. The primary problem with the Jerma section of Red Dead Redemption 2 is that it feels 100% like complete unembellished filler, like the Garlic Jr. saga from Dragon Ball, a random side adventure that's completely unrelated to the overarching story or narrative because something either within or outside of the story needed time to cook. Instead of continuing the intense, emotionally driven story arc of the gang's failed bank robbery and the deaths or captures of multiple members, you're instead bumbling around this island, participating in a conflict that the Vanderlyn gang has no investment or stake in, just waiting to return to America and the normal cowboy action. Hey, so that section of the script didn't sound as good as I wanted it to after I said it out loud, so I do want to go ahead and stress that I don't think stories or plights told about countries that are not America are intrinsically less interesting or less valuable. It's just that Red Dead Redemption 2 specifically is entirely a Wild West story aside from this, and that while playing the Jerma chapter, I would have preferred to be continuing the Wild West narrative. Again, nothing against stories featuring other cultures or other situations. It just unfortunately didn't come out of my mouth very good when I read it in the script there. Oh, but oh no, Javier's been shot. Will he make it? You know, the guy who's in the first game that takes place after this one, the guy who's confirmed from minute 1 to survive the events of this game. Another problem with Jerma is just how handholdy and railroady it is for a good chunk of its missions. Red Dead Redemption 2 has a greater issue with its missions involving a lot of walking or riding on horses behind other characters and listening to conversations instead of participating in actual gameplay, but these sections are usually enjoyable and carried by the dialogue being interesting and servicing the plot and characterization at large. Due to Jerma's disconnected nature from the rest of the story, however, a lot of these sections where you're in a chain gang on the beach or slowly sabotaging a sugar plant with Dutch end up feeling more like chores, especially on a second playthrough. I'm also not a fan of how Jerma's story progresses on a scale level. Like, this is a game about 1899 cowboys and outlaws in the Wild West. There should be no reason that a section of it involves blowing up a Cuban military vessel and fighting scores of soldiers in a beachfront siege. I do realize that this part of the story is based at least partially in real-world historical struggle and oppression, which I definitely recognize and don't want to sugarcoat, but it's particularly hard to care about in the context of this section of RDR2, both because, again, the rest of the game has nothing to do with this and it's immediately forgotten by the characters, and because Jerma isn't real. Combined with the tropical aesthetics, this entire section of the game just feels woefully out of place and disconnected from everything else in the game before and after it. It's also really short, only 4 or 5 missions, which sounds like a good thing, but it just ends up adding to the overall inconsequential and filler-esque nature of this part of the game. I won't pretend that there aren't things to like about Jerma. There are some very important character beats, particularly for Dutch, and Hercule is a cool and very helpful NPC. But as a whole, this almost feels like a DLC. Like you're in another environment on a short, isolated, entirely disconnected sub-adventure that's forgotten about as soon as it's over. That's like an expansion in any other game, yet it's a required part of Red Dead Redemption 2's storyline. I have a friend named Caught in Red who's a pretty popular artist and fan merch creator in the RDR2 space, and even he dislikes this chapter. He refers to it as a beach episode, which really is the best way to describe it. It's not terrible, but it is incredibly boring and easily the weakest part of Red Dead Redemption 2. At least it gave us the pregnant Micah meme, though. I'll tell ya, coming up with a flaw for Resident Evil 4 was the hardest part of making this video. Pound for pound, if you put a gun to my head and told me to name my pick for a perfect video game, I'd most likely say Resident Evil 4. This game is something else, man. Its story is a perfect mix of cheesy B-movie schlock and appropriately harrowing story beats. Its gameplay is timeless, with enthralling gunplay and a non-stop barrage of new ideas and threats to contend with. It's the perfect length, with nothing in the ways of padding or filler, and it's even got great bosses for a Resident Evil game. Again, this is my personal pick for the closest thing to a perfect video game that's ever been achieved. I've seen so many people pick it up, struggle a bit with the controls at first, and then end up loving it and replaying it ad nauseum by the end of their first playthrough. It is stellar. But do you remember those QuickTime events? Yeah, for as objectively amazing as Resident Evil 4 is, it does have one singular glaring flaw in the form of its mandatory QTEs. These are button prompts that show up during what appear to be ordinary cutscenes, only to ambush you with sudden inputs that mean immediate death if failed. It's alleviated somewhat by most of the game using the same few inputs for all of its QTEs, meaning that you just have to have your fingers over a few specific buttons during cutscenes and you're ready, and the game does fast forward straight to them if you skip the cutscenes, meaning you'll never be caught off guard in that case. But if you're on a first time playthrough and decide to watch the cutscenes in full, you've always got to be on your toes. This is made worse on both professional difficulty and by the frame rate changes present in modern ports of the game. Professional makes the QTEs much more strict by default, requiring faster timing and more rigorous button mashing, whereas the 60 FPS boost in modern versions of the game messes up the amount of inputs required for certain QTEs. Combine these two factors together and certain QuickTime events, such as running from the boulders or fighting off Krauser at the end of his infamous night fight, become virtually frame perfect and borderline impossible. This is a glaring oversight that only matters in certain versions of the game, sure, but due to those versions being the ones most readily available on modern platforms, it's especially egregious. But to be completely fair, there aren't that many QuickTime events in Resident Evil 4 to begin with, especially compared to something like Bayonetta, and the consequence for failing one is typically only being moved back a room or two, and maybe having to walk a few feet and skip a cutscene. This could have been a much worse, potentially game-ruining issue, and while I would have preferred Capcom not add QTEs at all, I am happy that they showed some degree of restraint with them. But the actual issue with Resident Evil 4 is that the rifle reload animation is 30 FPS, while the rest of the game is 60. That's unplayable. That's a game breaker right there. Dark Souls 1. You're a fun one, ain't ya? Dark Souls is interesting to discuss for this video, because depending on who you are and where your tastes lie, you could theoretically view anything about this game as a positive or a negative. Its slow and deliberate combat, its excruciating first-time player difficulty, its beginner's traps, its vague progression, its intentionally cryptic lore. Any and all of this is the kind of stuff that dedicated Souls heads love, yet the people who dislike these games vehemently reject. Me personally, I love Dark Souls 1, as weird as it is to say. It's probably one of my biggest comfort games, and I've come to appreciate its bizarre and nonsensical design a ton the more times I've played through it. Despite knowing and understanding that Bloodborne is objectively the better game, my heart still well and truly belongs to Dark Souls 1. However, there is one very commonly quoted fun fact about this game that doesn't take terribly intimate familiarity with it to notice on a first playthrough. Dark Souls was really rushed and budget restricted to boot, leading to its most glaring negative and possibly the weakest part of the entire Souls catalog, its entire second half. I know it might sound weird to say that Dark Souls 1's whole second half is a negative or a low point, especially considering how revered and respected this game is and how much I personally like it, but trust me, there is such an immediate and noticeable dip in quality in Dark Souls 1's design after its Honor Orlando level that it will leave you spellbound. Honor Orlando is the dedicated midpoint of Dark Souls 1, the place with the most visual splendor and some of the most difficult encounters in the game, and it's also the peak of the mountain for the game's quality because it's all down downhill from here. What starts out as a thoughtfully and deliberately designed game where every environment is painstakingly laid out and every enemy meticulously placed becomes a noticeably rushed budget job where past enemies and bosses are hastily mouse-dropped one after another, and the level designs become large open boxes with various copy-pasted traps and enemies trickled throughout. We've got Lost Izalith, a lake of fire filled with the same half-dragon enemies placed ad nauseum, Tomb of the Giants, a decrepit cave filled with the same skeleton enemies that you can barely see in, the Crystal Caves, a visually beautiful cavern that's ruined by reused enemies and goddamn invisible paths, and New Londo Ruins, a confusing sunken city that requires limited consumables to even damage its enemies in. If these levels, designs, and concepts didn't cue you into the fact that this game was running out of development resources by this point, then their gimmicks certainly will, with Izalith requiring a special ring to survive its lava, Tomb of the Giants basically requiring a light source to get through, Crystal Caves requiring navigation of its invisible death pits, and New Londo requiring a separate ring from a separate boss to access and survive its boss room. It's really telling that in 3 of these 4 areas, you physically cannot see or interface with the vast majority of their architecture and geometry. Almost like FromSoft was being squeezed dry by their publisher or something. And even if you do clear these areas, their bosses aren't great either. The Four Kings is a lame DPS check, Seath the Scaleless is just a big lumbering target who fills the arena with hitboxes, and the Bed of Chaos, legitimately, truly, and earnestly, the worst boss I've ever fought in a video game. The immediately noticeable drop-off in quality that's present as soon as you leave on Orlando in Dark Souls 1 is something that could be studied in game design classes. It is so drastic and so heartbreaking. But even with it, I still love this game. Like an annoying sponge to a grumpy squid, I'll never stop loving this game even if it wants nothing to do with me. The core gameplay loop of combat and exploration in Dark Souls is just so enthralling and fine-tuned that even with some of the worst areas and bosses in the series, I'll still find something to enjoy in any given playthrough of Dark Souls 1. Maybe it's masochism, maybe it's Stockholm Syndrome, or maybe I just want to fight Gwyn for the 8 millionth time. Who knows? I'd be willing to wager that No More Heroes is probably the most objectively flawed game in my top 10, let alone my top 5 when all factors are considered. It's got a brilliant and layered satirical story, very fun and stylish boss fights, and an extremely satisfying and fine-tuned combat loop, yet it's also indisputably padded to absolute shit, with a dialogue writing style that could affectionately be described as interesting, and a ton of mandatory grinding between levels and story beats. To be fair, I actually like and don't mind the grind for boss fights specifically. It's important to the game's themes and satire, and the game would be like 4 hours long max without it. What I do mind though is grinding for everything else in the game, and that's where my patience really runs thin in No More Heroes. Basically, to access pretty much all content in No More Heroes, you need to spend time doing mandatory side jobs and assassination missions to earn money, which is then spent on the entry fee to your ranked boss fights and other goodies. Like I said, this is fine for boss fights, no notes, but I cannot stand needing to earn money in equal measure for things like the game's optional clothing, permanent health and strength upgrades, and even the unlockable beam katanas that are required for the true ending. If you want to stand a ghost of a chance in No More Heroes, you will need to do boatloads of additional money grinding for everything on top of ranked battles. By the end of the game, these purchasables wind up costing equal or greater amounts than the ranked fights when all things are considered, meaning that you'll basically have to do multiple additional bosses worth of time wasting to access every bit of content. And as much as the game likes to pretend stuff like this is optional, it really isn't, as the game gets much harder without the paid stat upgrades, and as I mentioned earlier, the true ending and incredible true final boss are locked behind the purchasable beam katanas. On top of this, if you want to customize Travis, your player character, with clothing and outfits of your choice, or purchase the optional videos and wrestling moves as well, you'll also need to grind for those. It is nauseating on repeat playthroughs. And look, I'm not a stupid fucking idiot, I understand the satire. You have this guy who thinks he's a cool badass assassin needing to spend time doing embarrassing and meaningless odd jobs to fund his lifestyle. It's a big takedown of commerce and gamer culture and senseless violence and all of that, I understand. But why do we also have to grind for things that aren't the killing people parts of No More Heroes? Is this, of all places, where we really want to make this game mimic real life? This just feels like an overstep into satire on the developer's part, and considering that No More Heroes 3 would significantly truncate the grind, and that No More Heroes 2, which wasn't directed by this game's director so it doesn't actually matter, would would completely omit it, I'd say someone somewhere probably agreed with me. I don't think this ruins the game or anything. No More Heroes is still my second favorite game of all time, but it is easily the biggest hurdle to overcome when I recommend this game to others. And finally is my personal favorite game of all time, the one that I have replayed more than any other for the past 25 years, Paper Mario for the N64. This game is extremely special to me. Some of my earliest memories include playing it in some capacity, and it has always been, more than any other, my premier comfort and chill out game. While I do acknowledge that the Thousand Year Door is likely the better game on an objective level, I will never stop loving the N64 original Paper Mario. That said, there has always been one thing about this game that stuck in my craw. One glaring, demotivating, and baffling decision that leads me to feeling deflated every single time I come back around and beat this game. And funnily enough, it doesn't show its head until the very last moment of the game. Paper Mario does not have a post-game of any kind. It doesn't have a New Game Plus, it doesn't have a second lap or hidden mansion, it doesn't have a free roam post-credits mode to clean up missed content, it doesn't have a boss rush or optional bonus section. No. When the credits finish rolling in Paper Mario, the game stops on the final cutscene with the words "The End" on screen. It does not continue. Your only option is to turn off the console or reload your most recent pre-final boss save if you want to continue playing. You can't even save it after the credits to chronicle your completed save file. This has always made me so unreasonably frustrated with this game. I want to be able to show that I've beaten the game. I want to be able to loop back around to the completed save file to either play it again or clean up optional content. I want to be able to continue playing Paper Mario after the final boss without starting from scratch. It's especially puzzling because the original Super Mario Bros. On the NES had an option for a second lap. This game came out in the year 2000. The concept of post-games was well established by this point. I cannot conceive of a reason why Nintendo and Intelligent Systems would think to so thoroughly and decisively hardwall players from continuing to experience the game they already paid for. This is a 2000s RPG, not a modern live service game. This is the definitive reason that I love to see Paper Mario get a modern remake. Not to add new bosses or fix up dialogue or anything like that, but to make it so that I can finally experience a version of my favorite game that allows me to continue experiencing it. I love this game, and I know that I'd love it infinitely more if it gave me the opportunity to. Let me have a save file that definitively shows that I've done it all, and then some. Let me enjoy Paper Mario to the fullest extent that I'm capable of. Boy, that was sure a video. I have no idea what to expect from the reception on this one, so if you enjoyed, feel free to let me know in the comments. Also, share some of your favorite games and what your biggest issues with them are. Either way, thanks, hope you all had a fantastic day before, during, and after watching, and I'll catch you all later. Cheers!